Hello, everyone. I think it is my role to kick this off this afternoon. Thank you so much. We realize this is Friday afternoon for those of us in the New York City time zone, but we see a lot of people from everywhere. Pedro is calling in all the way from Brazil for this session. We're very excited to have you, Pedro, and a lot of people from greater New York area and as far out as New Jersey as well, and Texas. So delighted to be here. I have the best role here just to kick it off. My name is Anna Tavis. I am the Academic Director for Human Capital Management, the host of this program for today. And in our department, we are first and foremost focused on people and people's place in the workplace. So, and obviously this month we dedicated ourselves to be exploring the issues of actual action in the workplace in response to social justice, and especially in the wake of the events that happened this last summer. And we have the best panel for you to learn from and interact with. We do encourage you to write your questions, reactions into the chat. And one more thing that I want to announce, that is starting in March, we are kicking off a new certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have the best instructors to deliver it. So we are very committed to this topic, and I want to invite my colleague, Dr. Michael Valentine, who is the lead faculty in our Human Capital Management program, as well as the lead instructor in diversity and inclusion at NYU SPS. So Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Anna. It is an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to be part of the discussion today with such an amazing panel of professionals and the entire NYU community. Having been on a number of panels in my past, I can only say how humbled I am by the credentials and the accomplishments of our panel guests today. So Anna, thank you for the invitation to moderate, and certainly thank you to all my guests and the entire NYU community for being part of this discussion this afternoon on a Friday afternoon. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to certainly welcome everybody in the audience and provide a little bit of context for today's discussion. If you think about what has happened over the last year or two, I'd like to encourage you to think about this moment as this moment in time as an inflection point, and possibly an opportunity to take the experiences and the lessons from the last year or so and think about it and use it as a catalyst for change. So with that context, very, very lightly laid, I hope you'll listen and reflect on the discussion over the next hour or so. And at the end, ask yourselves, what will you do differently moving forward? So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel and certainly begin our journey. Dana Peterson is the chief economist and center leader of economy, strategy, and finance at the Conference Board. Dana joins the Conference Board from Citigroup, where for many years she served as the North American economist and later as a global economist. Her wealth of experience extends beyond the public sector. She was also spent time at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. Dana's wide-ranging economics portfolio includes many reports, research, analyzing global economic trends, having direct financial market implications, monetary policy, the list goes on and on and on. Her research has been featured in the United States on many of the news outlets that you're familiar with, certainly CNBC, Fox Business, Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. So Dana, thank you for being part of our discussion this afternoon. Natosha Rice is also with us this afternoon. She recently transitioned into her role at the Habitat for Humanity's International Division as the first Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. In addition to her work at Habitat, Natosha served as the assistant pastor of the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church here in Atlanta, which is where I am currently, for 11 years. And she's currently at All Saints Episcopal Church as a minister for public life. Natosha serves on the boards of the Global Harvard Alumni Association, the Atlanta Community Food Bank, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and Invest Atlanta's Emerging Markets Incorporated. Additionally, she's a highly regarded keynote speaker and workshop facilitator. She's received high acclaim for her TED Talk. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, If We Are More Alike Than Unalike, then, and you can look that up in YouTube, an excellent TED Talk. Welcome, Natosha, to our panel. And finally, Angela Dash is a coach who specializes in organizational conflict manager. She's a trainer, facilitator with over 20 years of leadership experience. As the president of the PACE Institute, she works with leaders and individual contributors from a wide range of industries, including tech, mass media, healthcare, education, higher education, county, state, tribal governments, financial, and non-for-profit. She's as I mentioned, a certified coach with ICF accreditation. She's also a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, or MINT, and has certifications through the Institute of Social and Emotional Intelligence. So welcome to the panel. Again, I can't tell you how in awe I am of all of you and the accomplishments that you bring to the discussion this afternoon. So I'd like to go ahead and start us off, and certainly if I missed anything in your introduction, I would encourage you to just to let our audience know a little bit more about you that you'd like to share. But Dana, maybe we can start with you. And I mentioned in your introduction that you, in addition to your role at the conference board, currently you were at Citigroup for quite some time, and you've done a lot of research. And so I'm curious about that research. In particular, you had done some work with regards to the economic cost of racism in the United States, and certainly your research in that area has contributed to the national conversation around this topic. And I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about that experience, what you learned, and how the report was actually received.
Absolutely, Mike, and thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, while I was back at Citi, I wrote a paper with others, of course, looking at the costs of racial economic gaps in the US. And the gaps that we looked at focused on kind of things that funnel into wealth. So home ownership, wage and income, having education, higher education and training, and also entrepreneurs having access to credit and financing along every spectrum of the financing channel. And when we added that all up, it summed to about $16 trillion of money left on the table over the last 20 years. from those racial gaps being in existence. And that's it, just to put that into perspective, that's if you added up the GDP of China and India, those two economies together. We know how big those economies are. And that's how much money was not generated by these racial gaps, in particular the gaps between white workers and black workers, or white families and black families within the US. And also, when we look at certainly the entrepreneurial channel, roughly 13 trillion of that 16 trillion was lost revenue that was never created because Black-owned businesses did not have access to capital. And also, just also thinking about those revenues, we lost out on roughly 6 million jobs a year that those Black entrepreneurs could have potentially created. So imagine 6 million jobs this year. We're down 9 million jobs. Like 9 million people are out of work right now. If we just close the racial gap in terms of entrepreneurs getting access to credit, we would add 6 million, right? So just put immediately 6 million people to work. And that's just really astounding. And what generated this report, or rather encouraged us to write this, was a reaction to what was going on last year in terms of several Black people being murdered while in police custody, and also the inequalities that we saw crop up, or rather were already in existence, but certainly highlighted during the pandemic in terms of inequity with respect to food security, health, housing, etc. And so the response was actually mostly positive that I received. But we did get some pushback where some people said, especially with respect to building out equity in the corporate setting, is that it's a zero-sum game. And our response is, well, it's a zero-sum game if you aren't willing to grow your business, right? So, but for the most part, I would say that we received very powerful feedback. Susan Rice a few weeks ago mentioned it. The brand new Treasury head, Janet Yellen, mentioned it. Current Federal Reserve Board Chair, Jay Powell, mentioned the report. And there's just been a really powerful response to looking at this from an economic perspective, in addition to looking at it in terms of a moral perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. I wonder, just as kind of a follow-up to what you're seeing, is what maybe might be out on the horizon that may start to address, some of the costs that you mentioned. I know you did talk a little bit about the reaction, at least with the current administration, but I'm wondering if you're seeing anything emerging with regards to addressing this issue, specifically in some of these communities that are in distress.
Sure. I think one great example is what's happening in the financial sector. I added up at least some of the announcements that I saw, and there were roughly $36 billion in commitments made by financial companies, including Citi, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, who were planning on taking this money and investing it in communities of color. And in particular, making sure that people have access to credit, that people have access to traditional banking, access to loans in order to purchase homes and cars and all those great things. And for entrepreneurs who usually, one point you made in the report is that at each point in the financing spectrum, from venture capitalism to going to capital markets to going to banks, they always receive less money than what they asked for. And so I think it's just really astounding and positive that you have the financial sector willing to make such a huge commitment and making sure that they are active in improving the livelihoods of peoples in communities of color.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is actually move down the funnel a little bit and talk about some of the challenges in the organizational space. And so the next question I'd like to pose to Natosha, similar to Dana's comments, as we kind of move forward, post-pandemic, we've got a new administration in place. What guidance would you provide for organizations moving forward and considering specifically the issues of justice in the workplace? What guidance might you provide to organizations to think about this topic?
Yeah, I think so there's a lot to that question. So oftentimes what I'll say is justice is what love looks like in public. And oftentimes what love looks like in the workplace is empathy, right? And justice and empathy interplay in a very powerful way. Simply stated, justice is often how do you meet the needs of the people you serve? And a quick analogy for that is I'm a mother of 3. So I always say to my children, I will never love you the same because you all need to be loved in a way that you need to be loved. So I will love you the way you need to be loved. That's the same way when you think about justice. Justice has an aspect of it that is focused on equity, and that is you meet the needs of people at the place where they have a need, right? So how do you assess that need? So in an organization, in a company, the first thing that needs to happen is to assess the need, right? And that really forces you to go beyond these really conceptual conversations on equality and to begin shifting to a conversation on equity. So equality is everyone, the door is open for everyone, but not everyone has the same starting point. So different people are going to get to the open door at different times. Equity is realizing that everyone has a different starting point. Some start at the starting line, some start at the 50-yard mark to get to a door that's at the 100-yard mark. How do we make sure those all the way back there at the starting line have an opportunity to also get to the door and get to the access, right? Which is why I love the work that Dana has been doing with the economic forecasting. I'm in the housing space. So what I love about the work that I'm doing now in the equity, inclusion, and diversity space in a housing organization is that we're forced to look at this conversation beyond a conversation of concept. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually our product. If we, and in order to produce it, we've got to be a tree that produces the fruit, right? So we've got to do the internal work, which forces us to look at being just, being empathetic. And I'll conclude with this because there's a lot of pieces to what I'm saying, but that is, the work that Adjunct, Thakor, and Robert Quinn have done. They produced that article, Creating a Purpose-Driven Organization. They really hone in on what happens when you connect people to purpose, when you infuse leadership in an organization with empathy. They say when you do that, people actually act outside of the norms of competitiveness. And they ultimately drive your company and your organization to promote financial health. So one of the things that they say is that people who find meaning in their work, if you're empathetic enough as a leader to connect to the meaning of your staff, to listen to them about what matters and what their needs are, when you do that, your folks don't hoard their energy. They don't hoard their dedication. They give freely. They defy conventional economic assumptions about self-interest. And all of a sudden, they want to participate as a teammate. They want to participate to drive the bottom line. So creating justice in your culture, creating a culture that includes speak up and speak out, that includes listening and seeing those who've been rendered invisible, that looks around the table and says, you know what, there's some people missing from this table. There are some voices missing. You cannot have innovation in a company that's driven by innovation without having diversity and inclusion, without having equity that brings them to the table. Lastly, I'll just say, when you have an organization that's focused on justice, you have a party because you have invited everyone to the party. That's your diversity. You've invited everyone to the dance floor. That's your inclusion. And the equity piece is everyone got a say in the playlist. When you have that kind of party going on, you've got ideas popping, you've got innovation happening, you've got bottom lines that are hit and exceeded. And that's what it looks like when you begin to paint that picture. Getting there is the part that everyone's trying to figure out right now, right? And everyone doing this work realizes it's very contextual, which means you have to be a leader that listens, and that listens.
Wonderful, wonderfully said. So I want to take that and go to Angela, because Angela, I know you spend a lot of time working with leaders in organization, and just pulling off of Natosha's comments, we often hear that leaders just don't know where to start with regards to this this topic of advancing racial justice. So, you know, what is it that you tell when you're working with these leaders so that they can understand, you know, their influence and just how they can start to create the environment where the party can emerge?
Definitely. And in these dialogues with leaders as well as with individual contributors, and I'm going to even start with the individual contributors, they want leaders who are showing that they're willing to learn. They're not looking for their leaders to be perfect. They're looking for leaders who say, you know what, we're trying to figure this out and we want to figure it out with you. One of the things is even how leaders are framing diversity. And I know we've moved to, and this is not to minimize that, but we've moved to expanding even the thought of diversity, right, and equity around diversity of thought and diversity of opinion, which is wonderful. Those things are great. But I think it's also important for us to focus on diversity in regards to people from marginalized groups, people who've been marginalized due to structural and institutional processes. Historically, that means that historically, and even what Dana was mentioning, right, historically have been limited or excluded from just meaningful participation in society. And because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about justice and when we're talking about equity. And so the first to keep that front and center and for the leader to keep that in mind, but showing that they're learning too. And that could be hard because leaders, it's hard for a lot of times leaders to, they're protective of their strong identity, right? And so that really takes a step towards being courageous to show vulnerability and to know that that is okay and actually is needed and wanted from their employees. Other things leaders are focusing on now and are even encouraged to focus on, just things as simple as like, what's in your job descriptions? Like, is everything in that job description a bona fide requirement for that job? I'm going to even speak about something that's, you know, not particularly race related, but I have a very close loved one and he has a visual impairment. And he was recently looking for some jobs, you know, looking at job requirements. And it was just, things were just randomly saying, need to have a driver's license. It had nothing to do with the job. But how are we casual about what's in these job descriptions? Let's build a hiring pipeline. How are we reaching out to these different communities, marginalized communities, and getting them in there? And how are we creating an organization that's built on that empathy that Natosha mentioned? How are we creating an inclusive culture where when the employees do come, that they feel belong, that they are being nurtured, that there are no disparities and in their development opportunities. There's research that says that leaders give feedback, and I wish I could cite it. I've heard it so many times, but leaders tend to give more feedback to people who are like them, right? So that right there, what happens then for the employees who are on the margin who are not getting that development of feedback? So how does that impact their growth? Yeah.
Great. You know, and I have a follow-up, which is of curiosity. I'm wondering if in your coaching work, you know, specifically over the last year or so, if you've noticed a difference in just awareness around some of these areas that you've just talked about with regards to leadership and how they think about, you know, racial justice in the workplace.
Definitely. I've seen a lot of awareness. A lot of their awareness has come through individual coaching as well as small group dialogue. And that awareness is coming from them touching becoming in touch with the moral issue here, and then even building some intentionality around it. And again, it seems so big, right? Because this is a huge problem, and I think a lot of people they feel stumped because they don't know where to begin. So I see that So even having people who can be good thought partners, it could even just be a community of friends who are good thought partners to help to get away from that feeling of stuckness and not knowing where to start.
Yeah, great. Great. I'm going to open this question up to the panel, and any of you can jump in and answer this one. You know, hopefully now we're seeing kind of the light at the end of this pandemic tunnel, and you know, we've all been through quite a bit the last 3 or 4 years, and I wonder from each of your perspectives and your experience, if you might comment a little bit on, you know, what the pandemic and some of the social strife that we've seen has revealed to us, lessons that, if you had the opportunity to convey, you know, here's what I think we should learn from, you know, from the last couple of years, what those lessons might be.
Yeah.
Sure, I don't mind starting. From an economic perspective, like I said, it really exposed a lot of the inequities that we're seeing. And I think one big issue was certainly remote work and who can work from home. And that really determined which jobs were lost last year and who's unemployed. And so anyone who worked in in-person services that wasn't, you know, an essential worker like a grocery worker or doctor or a nurse, those folks lost their jobs. And when we look at the demographics of that, it's overwhelmingly people who are young, older generations who were forced out and many of them retired, women, and also people of color. And even among people of color, women were very hard hit by the pandemic. And so it all speaks to, well, why is that the case? Well, many of these people found themselves in jobs that were either low wage or were in services oriented jobs that, you know, are susceptible to automation, right? So maybe your company didn't shut down, they just bought a robot or instituted a computer to do your job. So I think, you know, it's very important that we discuss things around education and training and making sure that, you know, at those very early parts of someone's life, that we're addressing these inequities. Because one thing that we showed in the report is that even among school children, where you live matters so much in terms of the quality of your education. And a lot of that's a function of how education is funded. And in many places, it's funded by property taxes. So if you live in a town that's not very wealthy and there aren't a lot of property taxes being generated, your school is not going to be so great. And even when you think about funding in general, that may come from state and local governments or even the federal government, it's the case that districts that have mostly white students versus non-white students receive so much more, almost twice as much in terms of funding. Now, why is that? That should not be the case. And so I think, you know, we really need to address these inequities at every point along the spectrum of someone's life, you know, from education to training, to where they're working, to being able to purchase a home, which is a huge generator of wealth, and also intergenerational wealth, having that ability to pass on something through inheritance, and even through, you know, more advanced things such as saving and investing, and even starting your own business. So I think those are the things that, you know, the pandemic really brought forth, that we have these gross inequities in the US that can be addressed and must be addressed. Otherwise, again, we're leaving tons of money on the table at a time when we need every dollar.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to jump in on that part, because I think to Dana's point, those inequities are, and to Angela's point, are often tied to race in this country. And so I think what the pandemic has shown us is, just because we don't want to talk about race, it's not going away. Just because we think we've moved into a post-racial society, as many people really tried to articulate after Obama's election, we've realized that that is not true. The pandemic has shown us the murder of George Floyd in broad daylight, which was not a new situation for many people to witness. It just so happens that the pandemic shut down every other distraction, and all of a sudden this country was fully focused in on this moment. it reminded us and helped us to realize, hopefully, if we were all paying attention, that there were pre-existing conditions to the pre-existing conditions that make people and communities vulnerable to the COVID-19 to the coronavirus. And I think, as Dana pointed out, even when you look at the issue of education, well, what is the inequity that leads to the lower property taxes that lead to a lower quality of education? Housing that has been segregated in this country by the federal, the state, and the local government. It is a constitutional violation right before our very eyes that has been put in place and put in play by the federal government, by the state governments, and by many local governments. What does that mean? That means that segregation that has been put into place from the 1920s and 30s, when the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages that were then extended to people of color. They would only insure mortgages with the guarantee that they would not be extended to Black families in this country. We see that then play out when the GI Bill came through in the 1950s that provided access to no down payment, low interest mortgages to white veterans returning from World War II, and denied that same benefit to Black families and Black veterans returning from World War II. What that then did was it created a wealth gap that has continued to grow generation after generation. So when these white families that were subsidized into the middle class of this country had an issue of job loss, they had equity in their homes to fall back on. When their children were ready to go to college, they had equity to pull out of their homes. That's why the conversation about school debt is a conversation about equity. When you look at the data and the amount of debt that many African-American graduates have on their plate as opposed to white graduates, you begin to see how the wealth gap continues to grow. There's so much data out there now, which Dana, I'm sure, could speak more to, but it's showing that the wealth gap in this country is between Black and white families is approximately between an 11 times or 13 times amount. It would take 11 to 13 Black families to equal the wealth of one average white family. That gap is as stark as it was in 1968, when the Kerner Commission came out and said that we live in two Americas, one white, one Black, and unequal. Why that's important? It is important because it now, generations later, leads to this disparity of resources in communities of color, leads to disparities of access to adequate healthcare, leads to quality disparities in terms of education, and it also leads to the political divisiveness we've witnessed that culminated in January 6th. Because your neighbors who live near you look like you, anyone who doesn't look like you is an other, and they're on the opposite side of the line from you. So this conversation on DE&I, I'll just finally say, is so much more than a concept. It's so much more than a business strategy. It is a conversation about humanity and the kind of community, nation we want to be today. If we do not force our organizations to begin to excavate their practices and their policies, if we don't force those people we vote for to put in office to excavate their souls, if we don't do it ourselves, we will continue to repeat. And we will continue to see this play itself out year after year, company after company, city after city, and community after community.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, really well said. I'd like to really think about and ask the panel, so how do we start to move from dialogue and awareness to action? I mean, part of what we want to achieve today is really thinking about what you're sharing with the audience in the in the container of an inflection point, and really helping us to think about how each of us can kind of take that next step forward to action. So, Angela, I'll throw it to you. At the individual level first, and working within the organization, thinking about all that has been said, and I'll comment from a personal standpoint to Natosha's comments, the weight of it on people of color and people who are not of color, right? Because we all bear some weight. How do we start to unlock ourselves from that weight to actually unparalyze the system and start to move in the right direction, just from from where you stand?
And Michael, I know you say, the actions, but I have to go back to what happens before the actions. And because I think it's so fundamental, and Natosha touched on it. And at the most fundamental level, we have to tap into our humanity first. Like that has to happen by just being able to acknowledge without judgment the historical and currently lived experiences of marginalized communities. So everything that Dana and Natosha just shared, like these are historical and currently lived experiences. And so to be able to acknowledge that, and over again, especially when I'm facilitating dialogue or trainings, I'm becoming more aware that individuals find it hard to acknowledge or have empathy for experiences of those that they don't relate to. This comes up a lot. And so, for example, if I lost a close loved one, right, to death, it's going to be really easy for my feelings to be evoked for somebody else with the similar experience, because we can relate. But if we start to look at this humanity or this empathy in a different way, where it's not us trying to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, where it's not that, because I'm seeing that in dialogue, that is keeping people from acting. I had an opportunity to be trained by a social worker, a therapist, Stephen Andrews. And he said that empathy is not about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's about putting yourself aside. That means that we can have empathy without drawing from shared experiences. And when I talk to people, they were like, okay, I see it now. Because what people are trying to do is to grasp onto something that they can relate to. For example, relate to the Black experience, right? Relate to the transgender community, relate to the differently able, and they're having a difficult time grasping, and therefore they're stuck. That's what's happening. And so if we put ourselves aside, meaning to step outside of ourselves to understand others, it really is just a deliberate exercise of social maturity. And so if we start looking at that, and choose empathy, Dr. Christine Moody, she's an empathy scholar. She said empathy is a choice. It's like this is an intentional exercise. But that right there will start to activate the awareness, the moral, the conviction, and just it's really saying, hey, I get you, I understand. I don't have to relate. I get you and I understand. But that awareness then could then transform into joining some small group, and it could come from and lead to just joining some small group conversations. I've had the opportunity to facilitate those and to be a part of it myself. Like I'm a part of some informal groups who say, hey, we want to advance racial justice. Recognize when other people and their voices are in the margin. Like, what are you doing? When you see that. When you're referring people to jobs and projects, like pay attention to who you're referring and who you're not referring. Like, who are you leaving out? Who's being left out of the meeting even? Like, for us to really have collective responsibility from whichever group you belong, even myself, I have to think that to myself. Who am I leaving out? What pictures or who am I quoting? What I have to pay attention to that. Who's being left out? And Angela, why are they being left out?
Yeah, so well said. I recently read a commentary on emerging trends for the next few years in the diversity and inclusion space. And one of the trends that they identified very prominently was this idea that more allies and advocates are going to emerge as a result of what we just came out of, to call out racism, especially in organizations. And I wonder if in fact that's true. So I'm going to pose it to the panel from your vantage point. If you think that trend in particular, this idea that it's the burden and the call out for some of the issues that we're talking about are actually going to start to surface across the spectrum and not just be by people of color or women in organizations and other systems. What's your sense for whether that's going to be a real tipping point for us or not?
Meaning, do you think that thinking that it will really happen on a
It
more
will
regular
really
basis?
happen. Yeah, it will really
Yeah.
happen. Yeah.
I see it happening some, but I think there's still some work to do in understanding positioning, for lack of a better term. So part of it is the way in which we language the narrative of these conversations. And this is one of my big pushes, because I think language is so important. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt. Words actually do hurt, right? So first and foremost, this conversation on allyship, I still think we're getting it wrong. We keep talking about, people of color and white folks being allies. And I keep trying to flip that back, because all that does is it continues to put the burden on people of color to carry the weight of a system that was implemented by people not of color. So when you talk about allyship, and I just get real basic with it, and I'm sure we could get into, I'm a political scientist by major. We can get into all these more technical conversations with it, but in a very simple level, country goes to war, and the people that join that country going to war to help them are their allies. So why are we putting the burden of war and battle on the people who are also the victims? What really should happen is we flip the conversation, and white folks should go to war because they're closest to the architects of this system. They benefit from it, whether they acknowledge it or not. And I'm not throwing guilt there. I'm just saying facts, right? You often benefit from it because of the privilege of the color of your skin in this country in particular, and let people of color be your allies. Tell us what strategies you want to go forth. Tell us what work you're going to put in, and we can be your allies. One last thing, and I'll get off the microphone with this, is that, we often talk about white supremacy. Why don't we start talking about our addiction to whiteness? Whiteness is a construct that has been put into place in such a way that it's buttressed so many of the social systems that we've already begun talking about today. So why don't we begin excavating our addiction to it and stop talking about it as if it's, when we say white supremacy, people are pushed off because I'm not a white supremacist. Well, you may not be, but you're addicted to whiteness. And it has benefited you whether you've acknowledged it or not. So one of the addictions to it is the fallout of privilege. This is one way that privilege acts itself out in these conversations. It acts itself out because it even allows the correction of some of the action of a privileged person to be said in a positive way. All of this conversation about unconscious bias, about implicit bias, that's privileged, because what it says to the person who's biased is, it's not your fault, it's just unconscious somewhere back in the playground of your mind. No, unconscious bias should just be called bias. Implicit bias is bias. When we say this, there were these microaggressions in the workplace, they're not micro to the victim, they're aggression. So until we begin really calling some of these things what they actually are and shifting the language, I think we will continue to have these conversations under a veil. And my hope is that the shifting of this language is something that we all engage in. I am not, and you, Michael, you hinted to this earlier, I'm not more equipped for this conversation. I'm just tired of my toe getting stepped on. All of us have to own this. And because whether we like it or not, we've all been handed this bag of goods from generation after generation. So what are we gonna create out of this bag of goods and figure out how to make it tasty?
Yeah, so what implication does that have for our diversity and inclusion work? And how do we start to reshift maybe the emphasis in our practice, in our diversity and inclusion practice, in any system that it takes place in, whether it's at the economic level, the macro level, or in organizations or at the individual level? So I'd be curious about, thinking about all of the dynamics that are in play here and the complexity of them. I mean, I think that there is a good intention in some cases and paralysis because of its complexity and just not knowing how to think about it, how to make meaning of it. So, in the context of the practice of diversity and inclusion, whatever system you're a part of, what do you see as an essential change that needs to happen as we move forward?
I think essential is acknowledging. I think acknowledging is that is critical for equity in organizations to move forward. That's critical for our society to move forward, for acknowledgement. And I don't mean it has to be a you know, on a billboard, but to really acknowledge and regard the historical and currently lived experiences of marginalized groups and how that came to be and what the outcome has been out of that. And to not rely on or have as a cushion intention, but to really think about the impact.
Yeah, yeah.
Like to say, I'm sorry, Angela, that I stepped on your foot.
Oh,
How can I help? Right? I mean, it's just something, you
Yes,
know, it's
that's
not,
okay.
I'm sorry I stepped on your foot. How can I help you to the chair to make sure you're okay?
Mm-hmm.
And to add on to what Angela said, and also what Natosha said, in terms of acknowledgement, I think when I think about corporations and businesses, a lot of times there is no acknowledgement if they don't measure it, right? So if you can't measure it, it doesn't matter. That's how businesses think. And so having businesses actually look at the metrics. So this is something that Citi actually did a few years ago, not willingly. Basically a shareholder who had a big wealthy shareholder asked Citi what they were paying their women and persons of color. And Citi went back, got some numbers, and they said, oh, 99 cents on the dollar. No one believed it. And I remember saying to someone who was super senior, like, you know, second in command at Citi globally, no one believes that number. And neither did the shareholder. So the shareholders said, go back and look again. And so Citi made another attempt and discovered, oh, gee, you know, there's a pretty big gap between what, you know, our women are making relative to our men and what our Black people are making relative to everyone else. And it was a pretty bad numbers in the US, and it was even worse in the UK. And so the first thing they had to do was measure it. And then they took the next step of acknowledging, oh, gee, there's a problem, right? And making it public. And then the next step is acting, right? And the action was, well, the next year, Citi actually made an attempt to equalize wages for women and Black people. They didn't make a big show of it, but I know it happened because, you know, when I looked at my paycheck, all of a sudden I got a bump. It's like, and so I asked all the women and all the Black people I knew, I'm like, did you get more money this year? They're like, yeah. So the company did make an attempt, but again, it had to first start with, you know, the push. And sometimes that push has to come from a wealthy investor or from the stakeholder, being the customer. And then they have to measure what's wrong. And then they have to acknowledge that this is wrong. Then they have to take the action to try to fix it. So I think that there's definitely a process, and depending on if you're a corporation, an individual, a nonprofit, investor, even the government, you have to have these metrics to help to acknowledge and take action.
Yeah, yeah.
Michael,
Natosha, I'm
ask?
wondering. Oh, sure. I was gonna come at you, but
Dana, you hit on something. I just wanted to ask. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to cut you off, Michael, but she said this. This is so important because not every company has metrics that are, for lack of a better term, as black and white as Citi, right? Or banking industry, and so I'm constantly in a pull-tug with, when I'm looking at the qualitative feedback that I'm hearing, that data doesn't always show, right? So I love that it was clear in that context because of the measurable, the things you were measuring. But sometimes I often wonder, how do you, when you're seeing a qualitative story that doesn't match that quantitative story, one question I've asked to try to bridge that is, what is your working hypothesis as you analyze the data? But I'd love, Dana, from someone who really is an expert in this area, what is another question that can help us bridge the gap sometimes between those differences?
Yeah, and Natosha, I was going to go where you started to go, which is, specifically context. And in your organization, I'm curious what, you're leading the initiative and the practice in your organization, and I'm curious how you're thinking about moving forward. Some of the actions that you're taking or that you're helping the organization to shape the D&I strategy there. If you could comment on that, it'd be great.
So we're a newcomer in this space in a certain way. We've been working in equity and housing for some time in various ways, but comprehensively as an organization, what I'm leading through right now is a comprehensive global assessment, DE&I assessment of the organization, to help me ask those kinds of questions. Like, what is it that, on the one hand, we see some good things perhaps on the quantitative side, but we need to also see the qualitative story in a comprehensive way. When we talk about DE&I being contextual for us, what does it look like in our Asia Pacific region, in our Latin American Caribbean region, in our Middle East region, and in the Africa hub, which are 11 countries in Africa? And then what does it look like in Seattle, Washington, and New York City? And right, so we've got a lot of context to evaluate and dig into, and really doing a SWOR analysis. So we're looking at those strengths and weaknesses, opportunities, which are really the gaps, and then the risks associated with moving forward courageously in those places and spaces.
Great, great. Okay, I want to be mindful of our time and make sure that we leave. I know that there's a lot of pent up energy in the audience, so I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. I'm going to throw one out to the panel, one last one, to try to bring us to a point where the audience can get involved. Our goal here, one of our objectives was to create a dialogue that really helped inspire those who want to take that step towards making a change, making a difference happen, to give them some guidance there. So I'm going to end with a question for each of you. And that question is, what advice would you give anybody in the audience? We've got a captive audience here who wants to be more active, who wants to move forward and make change happen. What advice would you give them to take that first step to get started?
Yeah, I'll say learn and continue to learn, right? To become more aware. Really set some intentions and have people who will help to hold you accountable to those intentions. I mean, that's even at the most basic individual level. So whether that's at an individual level or an organizational level.
So, Angela, I want to follow up there. And I want you to comment, because you work at the individual level so much. For a person of color who is struggling, what would you tell that person of color? And for somebody who's white, who is also struggling with some of the things that we've talked about today, what would you tell those individuals in terms of how to move forward?
Yeah. So for a person of color, I would even say the same, and I'm gonna tell you why. I had somebody I worked with for a while, after starting with the George Floyd situation, of a person of color, and was really struggling regarding the stress of racial injustice, right? Really struggling with it. And through that struggle was really experiencing things at work that they wanted to speak up about. And our entire coaching engagement was around that. And so it was them having more awareness of self, first of all, and really setting some intentions about how they want to show up in a different way to even be more of an advocate for themselves and other people who were experiencing what they were experiencing. And so I was that person's accountability partner, thought partner, and they end up developing more within their workplace. And it actually ended up resulting in being able to really start speaking up in the organization in a way that leaders heard, and change was actually made, not only that benefited her, but even others. so that's that's at the individual, and that was a person of color. So for just say for white individuals, right? The same. And what I've noticed has really worked for white individuals is a group experience where they're with other white individuals who are really trying to put their arms around this. I do some facilitation with a company called Kindred, and that's actually what they do. And but really coming together to work like for months together, monthly, and as a group, and they're holding each other accountable. They're learning, they're setting some intentions, and they're actually doing the work.
Great, great. Natosha, any thoughts?
I would have to second quite a bit of what Angela just said. I just finished co-leading with a white woman, 8 white women execs, nonprofit CEOs, through a kind of a anti-racism, 301 type 7-month experience. And it was a lot of truthful feedback and holding each other accountable. And that seemed to work very well. I think most of the folks on here probably know this already, but if you're trying to make strides in your organization that you're working in, please make sure that you've honed your craft. You've done your scope of work and you've done it well, so that as you step into this space, you have credibility for folks in the space to listen and respect you. That's one of the areas I would add to that.
Great, great. And Dana, any thoughts?
Sure. Sorry, I'm just, an economist at heart. And when we wrote the paper, I think the hardest thing was to talk about, at least for me, it was easy to add up the numbers. And it was also easy to talk about the historical perspective, as Natosha discussed earlier, in terms of these gaps are not new. They're not 20 years old. They're hundreds of years old. But the section on what can we do? And the hardest was talking about what individuals can do. And so I took it from the perspective of what Black individuals can do, or persons of color. And, some of these things, and a lot of times, it's like, oh, here we go again. If only people of color would just do X, Y, and Z, and even when we do X, Y, and Z, but I tried to be positive about it and constructive. And I said, well, there are a lot of areas that we can work on. So for example, re-embracing delayed gratification. I mean, our ancestors know about delayed gratification, right? Having to fight and wait and wait and fight and wait until, something happens. But in that waiting, still fighting and acting and not losing that. Also taking risk, particularly when it comes to ourselves with respect to investing in ourselves, investing in our finances, investing in education, in our children, in our communities, taking those risks. And then also advocating for yourself on the job, and as Natosha said, making sure that you're at the top of your game before you kick in your boss's door and demand a raise or, yeah. Opportunity. But, actually taking those risks on yourself and advocating, and then also using your power, right? Your economic power, your political power, right? All those things are at our disposal, and so those are the things that I would tell someone in order to improve themselves, economically. And I think, that applies to every racial group, but especially to persons of color, because for so long, we're told we can't take those risks, we can't advocate, but we can.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. And now what I'd like to do is open it up to our audience, and we will take questions either in the chat. We've got a couple of folks who are helping us to make sure we try to capture your questions if you want to place them in the chat. If you would like to raise your hand, you can do that as well. And for those of you at this point, I think everybody knows Zoom, but if you are not familiar, if you hit your participants icon, there should be a raised hand that you can just click on, and we'll be able to pick you up from that. So I'm going to open it up to the audience.
I see
see.
that Anna raised her
I
hand.
see Dr. Tavis is already up there.
This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. Very helpful. I would like you to comment on, again, the events of the last year, and if you felt along that trajectory, the arc of history, that there was a qualitative shift, not just quantitative, that more people showed up, et cetera. But do you feel that there was something different that what happened in the summer that set us up on a, maybe a faster track to a better world? But because there was a lot of discussion around that the events of the last summer and how different they were from, at least, a century before that. So if you feel that there was something different and something clicked that we can really build on going forward.
I'll just kind of expand a little bit about on the answer I gave earlier. The analogy that I've used, and this will date me, yes, I'm a Gen Xer, is that it was a similar moment to what happened when Roots aired on ABC. At the time that Roots aired, there were only really 3 networks, NBC, ABC, CBS, and everyone around the nation tuned in to watch the story and the history of bringing enslaved Africans to this country. With the pandemic having hit, it's almost as if what happened with George Floyd in Twin Cities, everyone was tuned in because we had nowhere else to tune in, because we were all at home. And so I think people began to pay attention in ways that they had not paid attention before. So in our offices, we had these gatherings of folks virtually, and people were crying. And I'm thinking, I'm raising 2 Black boys. I'm like, I've been terrified to let my sons leave the house since Trayvon Martin, right? And now, so what are people seeing differently? So Dr. Tavis, I was asking the same question, but I think there was this like nexus where everyone there were no football games, there were no basketball games, right? You weren't leaving the house to go. All of a sudden, folks tuned in and they saw what so many of us live through and see every day for the first time again. So I think that it affected it affected us in the corporate space this time, not just in the social media space and such. And that led to the creation of my role. So it was direct in my organization.
Yeah, I agree, Natosha. And I think too, because COVID, people, and still are, but especially at that time, I think were very compassionate about humanity, at last summer. And of course, and still meaning physically still, right? And also have been emotionally taxed. And really people, I saw it in all kind of conversations with people. People were just really being empathetic, right? And just compassionate overall. It was like, we're in this together kind of thing. The whole world, the whole nation is in this COVID thing together. And I think that too, because people go by relatability, right? I think that too, like you're suffering and you see somebody else who suffered. And I just hope that this isn't a false restart, or I hope it's not. I was listening to someone, I think John Fort, and he was saying historically things have looked like it was going to change before, maybe not in our generation, but it looked like it was going to change before, and it was really, we were fooled. It didn't. Yeah. So I'm hoping that this is for real.
Great, great. Alexis, I know you have your hand up. Nice to see you.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Valentine.
First of all, let me just say that I am blown away by this entire panel. To see women who look like me vocalizing and expressing the strength and convictions that change is needed, change is required, is refreshing, and it is motivational. So to all of the panelists, thank you so very much. A quick shout out to Dana. Unbeknownst to me, I was trying to figure out like why your name was familiar. I had shared your research with my organization. It fell on deaf ears, but that's a whole other story. So I wanted to ask the question specifically to Natosha. So I myself am a director in an organization that is homogenous. It is traditionally, historically white males. I am the only Black woman in leadership. So my question to you is specifically surrounding organizational change. How do you, as you'd imagine, that experience is othering, it's isolating. How do you impact some semblance of change when you are the only one, and not get bogged down by the fatigue of attempting to affect change in an organization that still historically is not ready to change?
Great question. Well, so I have to say, I have to join with you, Alexis, on the applause. I'm so grateful to be on this panel, and I could actually be greedy, and I just want to keep asking Angela and Dana and Michael questions. So great. So thank you for that question. So I'll try to answer one part of both of your questions. So the first part, it is very isolating. So you need your posse around you. So maybe not within the organization, but obviously having your kind of village of others who can help be that processing component of your work, whether it's having a quick group of friends who are in other spaces doing the same thing you're doing on quick text. I'm in this meeting again. I need y'all to give me a word of encouragement. I need you to tell me something, right? So you need that for yourself. But in that organization, in that space, one of the things that I often recommend, and that I'm also trying to put into practice and moving into my new space, is what are the real values in that organization, in that company? What is the mission of that organization, of that business? What is your business mission, right? What is your imperative that drives the bottom lines and the other lines of business in the organization? And then link that to the change you want to see. So in Habitat, I start out launching this saying, Habitat's a Christian organization. So we have a theological imperative to do this work. We're also a housing organization. So we have a mission imperative to do this work, right? So I'm linking the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion to those values and missions and ethos that drive the work of the full company, and saying, this is why this is important, because we want to be corporate partners, corporate citizens in our city. This is how we become a corporate citizen, right? So you try as best you can to link the change you want to see to the language that's already present that leads to success. The other is find out, and this is more work for you, and this is often the work of a person of color or a person of difference in a space. What are some of the ways you can connect to some of the influencers in the organization? You know, is he a golfer? Does he like mystery novels? Does he like to cook? And how do you connect to any of those? And if so, how you can then begin to connect that way to them? All of a sudden the guard goes down. I often say to women in all male spaces, and to all the men on here, I was raised by a single man. This is not an anti-man statement, but oftentimes men are looking at you. Are you wife? Are you daughter? Are you sister? Right? How are they to treat you? Right? And make it easy for them. I'm your friend. I'm your colleague, your partner. It's kind of how people kind of have and that's a way of saying people have all these assumptions about you before they know you. How do you help break those barriers? And then the last thing I'll just say, find those things that fill your cup and do them regularly.
Great. We have a question in the chat. Alina, I see your hand up, but let me get to the chat here for a second. This first question, I feel that academia, especially institutions of prestige, play a large part in the systematic issues that some of you have mentioned here. First, would you agree with this? And what can these institutions do in helping to assist specifically those underrepresented and marginalized communities. This one actually hits home this week. There was actually it was last week, I saw a New York Times article, and for those of you who don't know, I was leading their HR function for many years, about their diversity and inclusion climate in the newsroom. And so, you know, the New York Times is very much an institution. I totally get the weight of an institution and what kind of influence that can have on D&I work. So I wonder if the panel could just comment on, and this particular question is related to academia, but I think it's broader in terms of just those big institutions.
Sure, I'm happy to start here. In the paper, we wrote about an instance where the president of Harvard University mourned the fact that the graduating class was still 5% Black, and that was the same percentage that was like the very first integrated, racially integrated class. They started letting in Black people or something. You know, it was like forever ago, and the number hadn't changed. And the problem with that is that when we think about where corporations are looking for talent, a lot of times they go to the same well to draw water from. They'll go to the elite universities, but the elite universities may not have a diversity of students to draw from. And so, you know, it just kind of perpetuates this problem where you're always going back to the same places, you're getting the same people, the children of the same people, the grandchildren of the same people, and never anybody new or different. And so I think this is where certainly there are issues with the way that, you know, academia is addressing recruitment of their students, right? They're great at recruiting Black athletes, but what about, you know, the whole person, right? So I think that there's a lot that can be done in terms of the student body, what they're teaching students, and then also in terms of where companies go to recruit. And that's where I think, you know, nonprofits can come alongside and partner with, you know, corporations to connect students with the business, right? So for example, SEO or MLT or Inroads or many of these other different organizations. I mean, I know I'm getting away from the question, but it's all kind of, it's part of a you know, a pipeline, you know, a stream where, you know, you need to fix things, you know, here in order to get the outcome that you want over there. So, I mean, those are just some of my thoughts to start the conversation. Thanks.
Great, great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dana.
I'd like to add to that as well, because when we think about power, right, and sharing power, so it's like sharing power or having power over, you know, and when you think about having power over somebody, that's really oppression. And so when we're talking about marginalized communities, that's what has been happening historically. And marginalized communities have been then experienced trauma as a result of it, which comes from, again, power over. So sharing power really is coming from a spirit of partnership and even acceptance that you really do believe that these individuals, groups from these, you know, these communities are equipped, that they are equipped and whole. So it's like, so what are your thinking? And even in higher ed, right? I used to work for a medical university, and but even in higher ed, and of course now I work for NYU, but we do see this, right? Faculty versus staff, you know, people with terminal degrees and not, right? And though all kind of different things ends up getting into the structure of the organization, and on top of, you know, how the pre-existing to the existing, all of that, right? But how that ends up really compounding oppression. And so really, if we just operate in partnership and believe that people are equipped and worthy of being nurtured and developed, I think it would be easy for us to share power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so happy you went there because one of our audience actually asked that specific question, which was around this concept of power sharing in organizations and how that actually can happen. Alina, I'm sorry.
I just, one quick thing, you mentioned that I was in the Harvard Alum Association, so I have to jump in real quick. Dana's comment about Harvard, real quick, is that part of the president belaboring and bemoaning that led to a lot of shifts and changes. So just 2 years ago, Harvard had its largest entering class of African-American students in its history. My son happened to be one of those. So that's why I had to say that acknowledgement though, right, Dana and Angela, is what I think began to trigger some shifts and changes in terms of how they develop that pipeline and who and where they go. And then finally on the university piece, especially the larger institutions like an NYU and the others that we've mentioned, they, for better or less, yes, it's a great place of education, but there's a lot of indoctrination that happens there. They're crafting minds and thought processes of people who go on to lead countries and nations and companies. So they play a very significant role in creating that blueprint.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Elena, I want to get to you, and we probably have time for maybe one more question, but Elena, I know you've had your hand up for a little bit.
There we go. Dr. Mike, Dr. Anna, thank you so much for creating this space. To echo Alexis's sentiment, it's always wonderful to see powerful women of color in this space to be able to have this conversation. I will try to be succinct. As someone who is really looking to go into DEI, that's my passion, that's the work that I'd like to do. I have a concern more so with what's happened in the past year. I feel like diversity, inclusion, these lived experiences are starting to become a trend. It's starting to be turned into, it's the trendy thing to do. It's the trendy thing to talk about that companies are kind of honing in on. How would we, as somebody who wants to go into this field, who wants to do more, do better, create better workspaces, how do we go into these businesses and really try to focus on that? This is not a business trend. This is not just about getting into what's happening or what's hot for the moment, that these are lived experiences. How do you avoid that kind of shifting into that and really talking about the work that we need to do? Because the concern is it's going to get lost with time, if you will.
I'll only say one thing to that. I would even have that be my conversation before I even say yes to an offer. And if that's not where they are, if they are in this trend space and you're not even sensing that this is for real, I wouldn't even work there. Yeah.
I think that's such a great question. And I love Angela's answer as well. To that point, I'm definitely, and I came in the door in this position, just to your point, Angela, asking one, understanding the commitment, but also saying, at some point I want to change my title, because so much of what I'm doing is strategy. It's organizational strategy. That's the work I'm doing, that's focused on not just the people of the organization, but the operation of what we produce. So there may also be an expansion of how we talk about it. I don't want DEI to be siloed in any organization, and especially mine, as just this special thing we do when we, want to feel good about ourselves. It needs to be really much ingrained. So begin, as you think about approaching this work and the organizations you work for, how is this an organization where it will be ingrained into the DNA of the organization? And then how can you help be the steward of that? You keep refining it, you keep, so what does that look like? So the role itself is a more expanded version of the role, as well as the impact that it can have on the organization.
Yeah, it is very much a culture shaping role. It's not just about D&I. Any last questions from the audience? We're running close to the half hour. I want to make sure that we. Okay, I can't see all of the questions. So Chantel, can you?
Yeah, so I see Deborah, her hand was up.
Deborah, was your hand up from before? You're on, Deborah, you're on mute.
Yeah, I don't know why it wasn't unmuting me. Hi, Dr. Valentine's, great to see you. Dr. Dash, great to see you. And the other panelists, Natosha and Dana, thank you for being here as well. I just wanted to make a comment about the George Floyd situation. I think on top of what you all have already said, I think there's also the fact that a lot of times when these types of situations, as you were alluding to, Natosha, in the past, when it has happened, a lot of us have been at work, just distracted, right? And we weren't able to really see that this is happening in front of our face, and we weren't able to really digest it. And this time we were able to really digest it because, as you said, we were home, we were all watching it, we could not turn away. So I just wanted to make that comment, and it made me think about how many times these things have happened in the past, and I wasn't like fully present to really understand and digest what had happened. It was like a blip, and then tomorrow it was like something else, something else to put on top of that. I've been a part of NYU for 25 years. I'm now the recruiter in the library, and someone said to me, Deb, it's your, we heard, and this was a white woman, said, we heard you were brought in to bring in more diverse candidates. And at first I took it like, what? Why would you say that to me? And then my friend had said to me, Deb, why don't you spin that into something positive and think about what that means to you and maybe what the organization is needing. So I'm trying to reevaluate that. But I really liked what Dana said when you said stay in the fight, take risk, advocate for yourself. I find that doing this work is exhausting. It is really exhausting, especially when there are few people of color, especially in top management, top leadership, top management. And I just wanted to get your take on how do you, and I think, Natosha, you said it, you were like, find your network, right? When you are going into these tough conversations, find your network. Is there anything else that you could advise someone to do when you feel like you're alone in this and like you're hitting your head on the wall, to push, IDBEA, now we've added into the agenda, and as Dr. Valentine said, make it part of the system and not just a thing to do at this time?
I totally agree with what Natosha said. Like I have a few girls groups, right? One group of women who all worked at City at one point. We started this more than 10 years ago, where we just meet once a quarter and we just talk about what's going on, and we'll chat in between and pass on information about jobs. If someone has a question, we'll try to answer it. If someone had an experience, we try to, work through it. I mean, I think it's just so important to have those people also, as Angela said, to support you and to give you reality checks, and, just kind of be there, outside of your immediate day-to-day activity. And also, I really advocate, coaching. And Dr. Dash, is a coach. And at a certain point in your career, you need to invest in that coaching to figure out, okay, now I'm at the executive level or I'm advancing my job, and this is more politics than skill, right? So I think that that's very important, that you invest in yourself, as well as having, those outlets of other women who are striving and working, in their respective disciplines, and maybe the only where they are too.
I can't echo network as much as, it is one of the, having the community of support, it will benefit you with all of the challenges you're likely to face, Deborah, as you continue with your work. So I think I want to bring this to a close. This was an absolutely amazing experience for me personally. I want to certainly express my sincere appreciation for the panelists. I got to know a couple of you that for the first time, so I feel like I have now the opportunity to take that step with regards to my own personal growth, because my network now is bigger than it was an hour and a half ago. Certainly also express my appreciation to all of the audience who took time out of their day and on a Friday afternoon to join us. Without you, obviously this discussion has no impact. I'll close on the note that I started with, which is hopefully you'll be able to take a step back, think about some of the comments that were shared this afternoon, and think about what you can do differently. Tomorrow, when you go back to the office, to your community, we will only be able to realize the promise of our amazing community if we all take our part in it. And I would encourage you to challenge yourself to take some risks and take that first step. So with that, again, my appreciation to everybody. Be safe, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.